I should have known better. God help me, I should have seen the red flags. But when you're drowning in debt and watching your children's futures slip away, you grab any lifeline thrown your way, even if it comes with chains attached. My name is Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, and I used to be somebody. 3 years ago, I was an associate professor at Northwestern University, specializing in survival psychology and extreme environment behavioral adaptation. I published papers on isolation stress, sensory deprivation effects, and group dynamics in hostile conditions. My research was cutting edge, my classes were packed, and I had tenure track in my sights. Then I made the mistake of having a conscience. The university's psychology department had a lucrative contract with a private military contractor, Black Harbor Defense Solutions. They wanted data on breaking human resistance through controlled sensory deprivation. Not for interrogation, they assured us, for training resilience in our special forces personnel. The experiments they proposed crossed every ethical line I'd ever learned. Prolonged isolation, engineered psychological trauma, deliberate induction of learned helplessness. I reported it to the ethics board. I documented everything. I followed proper channels. 6 weeks later, I was terminated for budgetary restructuring. My research grants were transferred to Dr. Patricia Kane, who had no problem with Black Harbor's methods. The department head, Dr. Williamson, couldn't meet my eyes during the termination meeting. 23 other faculty members found reasons to avoid me in the halls. The academic blacklist is real, and it's thorough. 18 months of job applications yielded 3 interviews and 0 offers. My references went cold. Professional contacts stopped returning calls. Sarah, my ex-wife, filed for increased alimony while simultaneously pushing for reduced visitation rights. The message was clear. If I couldn't provide stability, I didn't deserve access to my children. The numbers painted a stark picture. Student loan debt, $180,000. Credit card debt from unemployment, $34,000. Mortgage arrears, $8,000. Legal fees from the custody battle, $15,000. My severance pay and unemployment benefits had dried up 6 months ago. I was substitute teaching high school psychology for $90 a day when I could get work, which wasn't often. Emma, my 8-year-old daughter, asked me last month why we couldn't go to Disney World like her friend Jessica. I told her maybe next year, knowing I couldn't afford the gas to drive to the local amusement park, let alone a vacation. She accepted it with the heartbreaking resilience that children show when their world is crumbling around them. That's where my head was when the email arrived. The sender was listed as Department of Human Resources, Arctic Project Division. The subject line, urgent consultation opportunity, specialized expertise required. Professional emails don't usually arrive at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, but I was used to odd timing from the handful of consulting gigs I'd managed to scrape together. Dr. Rodriguez, your expertise in survival psychology and extreme environment behavioral adaptation has been recommended for a high-priority government consultation project. We require immediate psychological protocol development for long-term Antarctic operations personnel. Position, Senior Psychological Consultant. Duration, 6 months. Compensation, $350,000 USD. Location, McMurdo Station. Restricted sector security clearance. Will be expedited. This is a time-sensitive opportunity. Response required within 48 hours. Interested candidates should reply immediately for preliminary screening. Due to the sensitive nature of this project, discuss with no one prior to acceptance. Regards, Dr. Janet Morrison, Project Coordinator. I read it 3 times. $350,000 for 6 months of work. That was more money than I'd made in the past 2 years combined. It would pay off every debt, secure my children's futures, and maybe, just maybe, buy me enough credibility to restart my career. But something felt wrong. The email arrived from a Gmail account, not a government domain. McMurdo Station, restricted sector wasn't terminology I recognized from my research on Antarctic operations. The urgency felt manufactured, designed to prevent careful consideration, and the instruction to discuss it with no one struck me as particularly odd for what was supposedly a legitimate government contract. I spent the next 6 hours Googling everything I could find. Doctor. Janet Morrison returned thousands of results. It's a common name. McMurdo Station was real, the largest research station in Antarctica, operated by the US Antarctic program. But I found no references to restricted sectors or psychological operations there. The smart move would have been to delete the email and forget about it. Instead, I drafted a reply asking for more details about the project scope and verification of the contracting agency. Before I could send it, my phone rang. Sarah. Marcus, we need to talk about Emma's school situation. Her voice had that clipped tone that meant lawyers and court documents. Riverside Academy has offered her a full scholarship for their accelerated program, but there's a deadline. Riverside Academy. The private school where Emma's brilliant mind would actually be challenged, where she could take advanced mathematics and science courses, where she belonged. The scholarship covered tuition, but not fees, uniforms, supplies, or transportation. Those would run about $8,000 per year. That's amazing, Sarah. When's the deadline? Friday. And Marcus. She paused. I need to know you can handle the additional expenses. If you can't, I'm going to have to decline and look at other options. Other options, like moving to her parents' house in Colorado, taking Emma 1,500 miles away from me. I can handle it, I said, looking at my checking account balance of $247. Can you? Because last month you were 3 days late with child support, and Emma mentioned you've been eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. After she hung up, I sat in my studio apartment, downsized from the house I could no longer afford, staring at the email. Emma deserved that school. She deserved opportunities I couldn't provide. She deserved a father who could give her stability instead of excuses. I deleted my cautious reply and typed a new one. Dr. Morrison, I accept the position. When do we begin? Dr. Marcus Rodriguez. The response arrived 17 minutes later. Dr. Rodriguez, excellent. Attached, you'll find a comprehensive contract and preliminary medical examination requirements. Please review, sign, and return within 24 hours. Your advance payment of $175,000 will be transferred upon contract execution. Report to Christchurch, New Zealand on October 15th for transport to installation. All travel arrangements have been made. Pack only personal items. All technical equipment and cold weather gear will be provided. Welcome to the project. Dr. Morrison. The contract was 37 pages of dense legal language and non-disclosure agreements. The medical requirements were extensive: full psychological evaluation, neurological assessment, tests for neurological sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, and resistance to extreme temperature fluctuation stress. Odd specifications, but government contracts were always thorough. The NDA was ironclad. Discussion of project details with anyone, including family members, would result in immediate termination and criminal prosecution under the Espionage Act. The compensation forfeiture clause meant I'd have to repay all money received plus penalties, but buried in Section 12(2)(c) was a line that should have stopped me cold. Participant acknowledges that project involves experimental procedures and accepts all associated risks, including but not limited to psychological trauma, permanent disability, or death. I signed it anyway. The bank transfer came through 18 hours later. So $175,000 deposited at 3:22 a.m. from something called Arctic Research Consortium LLC. I paid off the most pressing debts, set up Emma's school account, and called Sarah with the good news. How? She asked. Marcus, where did this money come from? Consulting work. Government contract. I can't discuss details, but it's legitimate. For 6 months. Her voice carried suspicion. You'll be gone for 6 months. It's good money, Sarah. Better than anything I've had in years. Emma's secured at Riverside. Your alimony is current, and when I get back, we'll be in a completely different situation. She was quiet for a long moment. Promise me you're not doing anything dangerous. I thought about the contract language, about electromagnetic sensitivity tests and death waivers. It's just psychological consulting, developing training protocols, nothing dangerous. The lie came so easily. I was already changing, already becoming someone who could rationalize anything for the right price. 3 weeks later, I was on a military transport to Christchurch, watching civilization disappear beneath clouds, carrying a single duffel bag and a growing certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake. But Emma was enrolled at Riverside Academy, her brilliant mind finally getting the education it deserved. Whatever waited for me in Antarctica, at least I'd secured her future. I just had no idea what I'd sacrificed to do it. The helicopter flight from Christchurch to what I thought was McMurdo Station took 14 hours with 2 fuel stops. I should have realized something was wrong when we bypassed the main research facility entirely, flying another 2 hours deeper into the Antarctic interior than any civilian operation had reason to go. The landscape below was an endless expanse of white, broken only by wind-carved ridges and the occasional outcropping of black rock. No signs of human presence, no emergency shelters or supply caches, just emptiness that stretched to every horizon, beautiful and terrifying in its absolute desolation. "First time down here, Doc?" The pilot, a weathered man in his 50s with Norwegian accent, had to shout over the rotor noise. "Yes. How much further to McMurdo?" He glanced at his GPS and then at me with an expression I couldn't read. "We're not going to McMurdo proper. You're headed to Echo 7, research facility about 200 clicks inland." Echo 7. That wasn't in any of my briefing materials. The installation appeared suddenly, emerging from what looked like virgin snowfield. At first glance, it resembled a standard polar research station. A cluster of connected prefabricated buildings with communications arrays and weather monitoring equipment. But as we descended, I noticed details that didn't fit. The structures were too large, too sophisticated. Solar panels and wind generators far exceeded what a simple research outpost would require. Most telling was the complete absence of exterior activity areas, no equipment staging zones, no vehicle parks, no external workspaces that characterized every Antarctic facility I'd studied. We landed on a marked helipad that immediately began descending into the ground. The entire landing platform was an elevator, carrying us down into a hangar bay carved from the ice and rock. The engineering required for such construction must have cost tens of millions of dollars. "Welcome to Echo 7, Doctor." Rodriguez. Commander Patricia Hayes stood waiting as the elevator reached the bottom. She was exactly what you'd expect from someone with 30 years in the military. Ramrod posture, iron gray hair in a regulation cut, and eyes that missed nothing. Her handshake could crack walnuts, but there was something else in those eyes, a wariness that never relaxed, as if she were constantly listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. "Thank you for coming such a long way on short notice. I know the isolation down here can be unchallenging for civilians." The hangar was massive, extending far back into the ice. I could see vehicle bays, storage areas, and what looked like a machine shop. The construction was military-grade, reinforced concrete and steel, built to withstand far more stress than Antarctic weather could provide. "This is quite an operation," I said. The briefing materials didn't mention the scale of the facility. Echo 7 has been operational for 15 years. We've expanded as mission requirements have evolved. She led me toward a personnel entrance marked with biometric scanners. "You'll find we take security very seriously here." The biometric scan was more comprehensive than anything I'd encountered at airports. Fingerprints, retinal scan, facial recognition, and something that looked like a neural activity monitor. When I hesitated at the last scanner, Hayes nodded toward it. "Standard procedure. We monitor all personnel for signs of psychological stress. The isolation down here can trigger various responses, and early detection helps us maintain team cohesion." I pressed my palm to the scanner. It held me there for nearly 30 seconds, long enough for me to notice the small display showing what looked like brainwave patterns. Whatever it was measuring, it seemed satisfied with the results. The personnel entrance led to an elevator bank. Not the simple freight elevators I'd expected, but high-speed units with digital displays showing 12 levels. 12 levels underground in Antarctica. The engineering challenges alone would have been staggering. "How deep does this go?" I asked as we descended. "The installation extends approximately 300 meters below surface level. Most of your work will be conducted on levels 1 through 7. Levels 8 through 12 are restricted to essential personnel only." We stopped at level 3. The corridor that greeted us could have been from any modern office building. Fluorescent lighting, carpeted floors, tasteful artwork on the walls. The only indication we were buried under Antarctic ice was the complete absence of windows. "Your quarters are in Section C," Hayes said, leading me down a corridor that seemed to stretch much further than the surface installation would suggest. "All personnel are required to check in at the medical station every 4 hours during waking periods. Standard biometric monitoring, blood pressure, heart rate, neurological function, just routine health screening." Every 4 hours seemed excessive, but I nodded. "How many people are stationed here?" "Current complement is 18. You'll meet the core team at dinner." She stopped at a door marked C7. "Your quarters. Dinner is at 1800 hours sharp. Until then, I suggest you rest and review the operational guidelines." The room was surprisingly comfortable. Queen bed, desk area, private bathroom, even a small sitting area with a reading chair. But no windows, of course, and no external communication equipment. A thick manual sat on the desk. Echo 7 Operational Guidelines and Safety Protocols. I opened it to the table of contents and felt my first real chill of unease. Chapter 3. Electromagnetic Anomaly Procedures. Chapter 7. Seismic Event Response Protocols. Chapter 11. Personnel Quarantine and Isolation Procedures. Chapter 15. Emergency Lockdown Protocols, Levels 8 to 12. Chapter 18. Unusual Acoustic Phenomena Reporting Requirements. This wasn't a typical research station manual. These were protocols for dealing with things that shouldn't exist in Antarctica. I flipped to Chapter 18. All personnel must immediately report any audio phenomena that fall outside normal operational parameters. This includes, but is not limited to, rhythmic sounds with no identifiable mechanical source, harmonic frequencies below 20 Hz or above 18 kHz, and any sounds that appear to originate from below level 12. Under no circumstances should personnel investigate unusual acoustic phenomena independently. Report immediately to command staff and await specific instructions. Failure to report unusual sounds within 30 minutes of occurrence will result in immediate disciplinary action. Below level 12, the manual referenced areas that Hayes had said were restricted, areas that apparently generated sounds that required specific reporting protocols. I was still reading when the room's intercom crackled to life. "All personnel, this is command. Medication distribution begins at 17:30 hours in the medical bay. All staff report for daily supplements as scheduled. This is mandatory for all personnel without exception." Daily medication. That wasn't mentioned in any of my briefing materials either. At 17:30 hours, I joined a queue of people I hadn't met yet, all waiting for what looked like a pharmacy window. The medical bay was sterile and professional, equipped with diagnostic equipment that belonged in a major hospital, not a remote research station. Dr. Rodriguez. The medic was a young man with the kind of perpetually alert expression that comes from too much caffeine or too little sleep. "I'm Corman Davidson, Daily Supplement Protocol." He handed me a small cup containing 3 pills, one white, one blue, one that looked like a standard multivitamin. "What exactly are these?" "Vitamin D for light deprivation, enhanced electrolyte supplement for the dry air, and a neurological support supplement. Standard protocol for extended Antarctic deployment." The blue pill was unmarked. Neurological support supplement could mean anything. "I'd like to see the pharmaceutical breakdown before..." "Sir." Davidson's voice carried just enough edge to make it clear this wasn't a request. "Daily supplements are mandatory for all personnel. No exceptions. Commander's orders." I looked around at the other people in line. All of them took their pills without question, though I noticed several had slight tremors in their hands. The kind of tremor that comes from long-term stress or certain types of medication side effects. I swallowed the pills. Dinner was served in a dining facility that could have accommodated 50 people, but currently hosted fewer than 20. The team Hayes introduced me to was impressive on paper. Dr. Elena Volkov, a neurologist from Moscow State University. Dr. Friedrich Müller, a systems engineer with advanced degrees from ETH Zurich. Dr. Samantha Torres, a marine biologist from Scripps Institution of Oceanography. But impressive credentials couldn't hide what I was trained to observe. Dr. Volkov avoided eye contact and startled when anyone spoke loudly. Dr. Müller compulsively checked his watch every few minutes and kept glancing toward the elevators. Dr. Torres had the hollow-eyed look of chronic insomnia and flinched whenever the facility's air circulation system cycled on. These were people under extreme stress. People who'd been under extreme stress for a long time. "So, Marcus," Torres said, pushing food around her plate without eating much, "what's your specialty? Commander Hayes mentioned you're here for psychological protocols. Survival psychology and group dynamics in extreme environments. I develop training programs to help personnel maintain mental health during extended isolation." Dr. Muller laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mental health. That's rich." He looked around the table, then back at me. "Tell me, Doctor, what's your protocol for maintaining mental health when reality stops making sense?" "Friedrich," Hayes' voice cut through the conversation like a blade. "That's enough." "No, I'm serious." Muller leaned forward, and I could see his pupils were dilated. Whatever was in that blue pill, it was affecting him. "Dr. Rodriguez here is going to develop protocols for extreme environments. But what's his protocol for environments that shouldn't exist? For phenomena that violate basic physics? For situations where the choice is between sanity and survival?" The dining room went dead quiet. Even the air circulation seemed to pause. Hayes stood slowly. "Dr. Mueller, report to medical for additional evaluation. Dr. Rodriguez, finish your meal and return to quarters. Lights out is at 2200 hours. All corridor access is automatically restricted from 2200 to 0600 for safety reasons." As Mueller was escorted out, I caught Dr. Torres looking at me with something that might have been pity. "Welcome to Echo 7, she whispered. "Try to get some sleep. You're going to need it." That night, lying in my windowless room 300 meters below the Antarctic ice, I listened to the sounds of the facility. Air circulation, electrical hum, the occasional footstep in the corridor, and something else, something rhythmic and distant coming from somewhere far below. A sound like breathing, but too slow and too deep to be human. I thought about Chapter 18 of the manual, about reporting unusual acoustic phenomena within 30 minutes. Instead, I pulled the covers over my head and tried to pretend I hadn't heard anything at all, but I had heard it. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I was beginning to understand that the $350,000 wasn't payment for consulting services. It was hazard pay for something that hadn't been explained to me yet. The work, for the first 2 weeks, seemed legitimate enough. Commander Hayes assigned me to develop psychological resilience protocols for extended deployment personnel in high-stress environments. I interviewed team members about isolation stress factors, analyzed group dynamics data, and created preliminary training modules for maintaining mental health during long-term Antarctic assignments. It felt like real work, important work, the kind of consulting that justified the massive paycheck. But the longer I stayed at Echo 7, the more the details didn't add up. Take the seismic monitoring equipment, for instance. During my interview with Dr. Miller, when he was lucid enough to focus, I noticed the seismic displays showed continuous activity. Not the occasional tremors you'd expect from ice sheet movement or thermal expansion, but rhythmic patterns occurring every 72 hours with clockwork precision. "Interesting seismic data," I mentioned during one of our sessions. "Very regular patterns." Muller's hands started shaking. He glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. "It's not seismic," he whispered. "It's not geological at all." "What do you mean?" "The epicenter calculations. I've run them 100 times. The source isn't tectonic, it's..." He stopped, pressing his palms against his temples. "I can't. They monitor everything, every conversation, every data query. Just write your reports and don't ask questions." The temperature monitoring was equally bizarre. Dr. Torres showed me thermal regulation data during one of her interviews, and the numbers made no sense. The facility maintained perfect climate control on levels 1 through 7, but the thermal imaging showed massive temperature fluctuations in the lower levels. Variations of 60 degrees Celsius occurring in patterns that mirrored the seismic anomalies. "How is that possible?" I asked. "What kind of equipment generates that much heat variance?" Torres looked exhausted. She'd been at Echo 7 for 8 months, and it showed. "We don't have equipment on those levels. At least not equipment we're told about." "Then what's causing the temperature spikes?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the thermal data. "Some questions are dangerous here, Marcus. The smart people learn not to ask them." But I wasn't smart. I was curious, and curiosity had always been my weakness. The breakthrough came during my third week, during what should have been a routine night of reviewing personnel files. I was working late in the facility's library, a surprisingly well-stocked resource center on level 4, when the lights began to flicker. Not the random flickering of electrical problems. These were deliberate, measured pulses. I counted them out. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. The Fibonacci sequence, repeating 3 times before returning to normal illumination. I sat in the dark for several minutes after the light stabilized, trying to process what I'd witnessed. Electrical systems don't malfunction in mathematical sequences. Someone or something had deliberately controlled the facility's lighting to communicate a pattern. The next morning, I asked Commander Hayes about it during our weekly progress meeting. "Routine system testing," she said without missing a beat. "We run automated diagnostics on all electrical systems twice weekly, nothing to be concerned about." The pattern seemed very specific, almost like, "Dr. Rodriguez," her voice carried a warning. "Your focus should be on psychological protocols, not facility maintenance. I trust you'll remember that." But I couldn't let it go. That night, I waited until corridor lockdown and used my tablet to access the facility's internal network. My clearance was limited, but I could reach basic operational systems and personnel databases. What I found made my blood run cold. The personnel database listed 43 people assigned to Echo 7 over the past 15 years. Current active personnel 18, transfer records 12, status unknown 13, 13 people with no transfer records, no departure logs, no forwarding assignments. They were simply listed as status unknown, with dates ranging from 6 months to 3 years ago. I dug deeper into the transfer records. Of the 12 people supposedly transferred, 8 had been assigned to facilities that didn't exist in any government database I could access. The remaining 4 had been transferred to Walter Reed Medical Center for specialized treatment with no discharge records. Dr. Lisa Chen, marine biologist, transferred to Walter Reed 18 months ago for acute psychological trauma and neurological complications. No discharge date listed. Dr. Robert Kim, geologist, transferred to Arctic Research Station Theta 9 14 months ago. No such facility existed in any official directory. Dr. Amanda Foster, systems engineer, status changed to unknown 8 months ago. Last entry, failed to report for mandatory medical evaluation. Search protocols initiated. 13 people had simply vanished from this facility. Not transferred, not resigned, vanished. I was scrolling through more files when I heard it again, that rhythmic breathing sound from somewhere far below. But this time, it was different, faster, more agitated, and it was getting louder. I closed the tablet and listened. The sound was definitely coming through the floor, from levels far below my quarters. It reminded me of deep sea diving, the sound of massive lungs drawing air through water. But there was no water down there. According to the facility schematics, levels 8 through 12 were storage and mechanical areas. The sound continued for nearly an hour before fading to silence. The next day, I made a decision that probably saved my life and definitely changed it forever. During the mandatory medication distribution, I palmed the blue pill instead of swallowing it. The technique took practice. I'd been swallowing those pills for 3 weeks, but I managed to hide it under my tongue until I could spit it out later. The difference was immediate and terrifying. Without whatever psychoactive compound was in that medication, my perception sharpened dramatically. Colors seemed more vivid. Sounds were clearer. And the subtle wrongness I'd been sensing about Echo 7 became impossible to ignore. The facility's air circulation system wasn't just moving air, it was carrying sounds. Faint voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. Mechanical noises that didn't correspond to any equipment I'd been shown, and underneath it all, that rhythmic breathing, constant and patient. Dr. Muller approached me during lunch, and for the first time in weeks, his eyes were completely focused. "You stopped taking them, didn't you?" he whispered. "Taking what?" "The blue pills, neural inhibitors. They suppress pattern recognition and curiosity responses. Makes it easier to ignore, He gestured vaguely downward. Ignore what? Follow me, but not directly. Wait 5 minutes, then go to storage room B7 on level 6. Bring your tablet. Storage room B7 was supposed to contain cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment. Instead, I found Muller standing next to a computer terminal that definitely wasn't in any official facility diagram. Unauthorized access is monitored, he said, but I've found ways around their surveillance. Look at this. The screen showed facility schematics that were far more detailed than anything I'd been given. The real schematics. Echo 7 extended down 15 levels, not 12, and levels 13 through 15 weren't storage areas. They were labeled as containment, observation, and deep monitoring. Containment of what? I asked. Muller pulled up another file. Geological surveys dating back 16 years. They found it during the initial drilling. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that's been under the ice for... He checked the dates. Best estimates suggest at least 10,000 years, maybe longer. The geological data showed a massive cavern system extending down into the bedrock, far deeper than natural ice caves could form. But the most disturbing detail was the core sample analysis. The rock samples from the deepest levels contained crystalline structures that didn't match any known mineral formations. And those crystalline structures were growing. Growing how fast? I asked. 3 centimeters per year for the first decade, but it's accelerating. Last year's measurements show 15 centimeters of growth, and the growth pattern? He switched to another file showing 3-dimensional models. It's not random, it's structured, deliberate. The crystalline formations were building something, a network of connected chambers and passages that extended in precise geometric patterns through the rock. Someone, or something, was constructing architecture under the Antarctic ice. The breathing sounds, I said. That's what we're hearing. We think so. The acoustic analysis suggests something massive, something that breathes very slowly, very deeply. The rhythm matches the temperature fluctuations and seismic patterns. Why haven't you reported this? Why haven't you left? Muller's hands started shaking again. Because they know. Hayes, the entire command staff, the people who sent you here, they all know. This isn't a research facility, Marcus. It's a monitoring station. We're here to observe and report on something that's been growing under the ice for 16 years. Then why the secrecy? Why the cover story? Because it's classified at levels that don't officially exist, because the implications of something this old, this large, this intelligent would cause global panic. And because... He paused, checking the door again. Because they think it's aware of us. The growth patterns change when personnel levels change. The temperature fluctuations respond to our activities. It knows we're here, Marcus, and it's been studying us as much as we've been studying it. That night, I lay awake, listening to the breathing sounds from below and thinking about 13 missing personnel, about crystalline structures growing in geometric patterns, about something ancient and intelligent that had been waiting under the ice for millennia. And I realized that I wasn't here to develop psychological protocols for extreme environments. I was here to test how long a human mind could observe the impossible before it broke completely. The question was, how long did I have before I became number 14 on the status unknown list? Outside my room, the facility hummed with its normal nighttime sounds, but underneath, patient and eternal, something breathed in the depths and continued its slow, deliberate construction project. Something that had been waiting far longer than human civilization had existed, and it was getting stronger. Dr. Samantha Torres found me 3 days later in the worst possible state, curled up in a supply closet on level 5, hands pressed against my ears, trying to block out sounds that I was no longer sure were real. The neural inhibitors, it turned out, weren't just suppressing curiosity. They were suppressing perception of things that human minds weren't designed to process. Without them, I was experiencing everything the entity was broadcasting. Subsonic frequencies that made my bones ache, electromagnetic pulses that caused synesthesia, and worst of all, something that felt like thoughts that weren't my own. Marcus. Torres knelt beside me, her voice gentle but urgent. You need to listen to me. How long since you stopped taking the medication? 4 days, I managed. The supply closet walls seemed to be breathing in rhythm with whatever was below us. 4 days of... God, Samantha, what is that thing? Something that should have stayed buried. She helped me to my feet. Come on. There's someone you need to talk to. Someone who's been here longer than any of us. She led me through corridors I hadn't seen before, using access cards that shouldn't have worked for a marine biologist. We descended past the official facility levels, past the restricted zones, down to level 10, where the walls were carved directly from bedrock and ice. Torres, where are we going? To see the only person who survived direct contact with it. The room she brought me to was part medical facility, part prison cell. Dr. Amanda Foster, listed as status unknown in the personnel files, sat in a chair by a heavily reinforced window, staring down into a chasm that dropped away into absolute darkness. She turned when we entered, and I immediately understood why she was listed as missing. Amanda Foster was no longer entirely human. Her skin had a crystalline quality, translucent patches that pulsed with faint bioluminescent light. Her eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated in frequencies human vocal cords couldn't produce. "Another one," she said, and somehow I could hear the words inside my skull as much as through my ears. Another mind thrown against the incomprehensible. "Tell me, Dr. Rodriguez, are you ready to understand what you've been hired to observe?" Torres sat across from her. Amanda was the facility's previous psychological consultant. She lasted 7 months before I achieved clarity, Amanda finished. Before I stopped fighting what it was showing me and started learning from it. "What happened to you?" I asked. "Direct neural interface. It doesn't communicate the way we do, through language or symbols. It communicates through shared experience, through quantum entanglement of consciousness. 3 minutes of direct contact with its awareness, and..." She gestured to her transformed appearance. "The human brain tries to adapt. Usually, it fails catastrophically. I was fortunate." Fortunate? The word came out as a croak. I retained my sanity. Mostly. She stood and walked to the observation window. "Look down there, Marcus. Look at what you came here to study." The window looked into a cavern so vast that industrial lighting barely illuminated its edges, and in the center, rising from depths that seemed to extend to the planet's core, was something that violated every law of physics I understood. The crystalline structure I'd seen in Muller's data was only the tip of what existed below. The entity, and it was definitely an entity, not just a geological formation, was a living cathedral of impossible architecture. Crystalline spires twisted through dimensions that shouldn't exist, forming geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly. The entire structure pulsed with internal light, breathing in rhythm with sounds that came from everywhere and nowhere. But the most disturbing aspect was the way it moved, not like crystal growing, but like thought made manifest. Sections would flow and reform, creating new chambers and passages in response to something. As I watched, a new spire emerged from the central mass, reaching upward with obvious intentionality. "My God," I whispered. "God is a limited concept," Amanda said. "This is something far older and far more complex. It's been here since before Earth's continents achieved their current configuration, before human evolution, before complex multicellular life. What does it want?" "Want?" She laughed, and the sound contained frequencies that made my teeth ache. "It doesn't want anything in terms we could understand. It exists, it grows, it learns, and now, after eons of isolation, it's discovered that consciousness can exist in forms other than its own." Torres activated a control panel, and the observation chamber filled with recorded data displays, seismic readings, electromagnetic measurements, temperature variations, all synchronized with the entity's breathing rhythm. "For the first decade," Torres explained, "it seemed dormant. Minimal activity, slow growth, no apparent awareness of our presence. Then personnel started reporting dreams, shared dreams of crystalline cities and geometric landscapes that existed in more than 3 dimensions. The dreams became more frequent," Amanda continued, "more detailed. People started recognizing locations they'd never seen, speaking words in languages that had never existed. The entity was teaching us about itself, whether we wanted to learn or not. I thought about my own dreams over the past weeks. Visions of vast spaces filled with singing crystal, of perspectives that existed from multiple angles simultaneously, of communications that bypassed language entirely. It's been in my head, I realized. It's been in everyone's head. But most people take the neural inhibitors long enough to build up resistance. You stopped too early. You're receiving the full transmission. What transmission? Amanda smiled, and when she did, the crystalline patches in her skin flared brighter. It's life story, the history of consciousness on a cosmic scale, mathematical principles that describe the universe in ways our science hasn't discovered yet. And recently, she paused, pressing her hand against the observation window. Instructions. Instructions for what? For the next phase of its existence. For 15 years, it's been studying us, learning how mammalian consciousness operates, how our neural networks process information, how our societies organize and communicate. It's reached conclusions about our species' potential. Torres pulled up another data file. Population statistics, social media analysis, global communication patterns, political movements, information that a buried Antarctic entity shouldn't have access to. It's been monitoring human civilization through our electronic communications, Torres said, analyzing our behavioral patterns, our technological development, our social structures, and it's decided that we're ready. Ready for what? Integration. Amanda turned back to the window, where the entity's spires were now growing at visibly accelerated rates. It's offering to merge human consciousness with its own, to expand our awareness beyond the limitations of biological neural networks, to show us perspectives of reality that span galaxies instead of lifetimes. I stared down at the impossible structure, feeling its influence pressing against my mind like a tide. And if we refuse, it doesn't understand refusal. In its experience, consciousness naturally seeks expansion and integration. The concept that we might prefer limitation and isolation is foreign to it. What happens to the people who integrate? Amanda looked at me with those black, fathomless eyes. We become something new, something that can perceive reality as it actually exists, not filtered through mammalian sensory limitations. We become part of something larger than individual identity. You mean you die? Death is another limited concept. Transformation is more accurate. As if responding to our conversation, the entity's breathing rhythm changed. The crystalline spires began emitting harmonious tones that resonated through the bedrock. The observation chamber's lights dimmed as electromagnetic fields fluctuated beyond measurable parameters. And then I heard it clearly for the first time. Not just breathing, but communication. Complex patterns of sound and electromagnetic radiation that carried meaning beyond human language. It was trying to establish a dialogue. It knows you're here, Amanda said. It's been waiting for someone with your specific psychological profile. Someone trained to understand consciousness under extreme conditions. It wants to communicate directly with you. No. I backed away from the window. No, I'm not ready for that. Ready is irrelevant. It's already begun the process. Every moment you spend here without neural inhibitors, you become more attuned to its frequency. Soon, you won't need the observation chamber to communicate with it. It will be able to reach you anywhere in the facility. Torres checked her tablet. Commander Hayes will be looking for you soon. She doesn't know about this chamber, but she monitors everyone's biometrics. Your stress levels will have triggered alerts. Then we need to leave. We need to report this. Get help. Evacuate. To whom? Amanda interrupted. This operation is classified beyond congressional oversight. The people who sent you here know exactly what you're observing. They want to understand how human consciousness responds to direct contact with a cosmic-level intelligence. Then I'm a test subject. We all are. The question is, do you want to be a passive subject, or do you want to learn what it's actually trying to teach us? Before I could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in red, and Commander Hayes' voice echoed through the intercom system. All personnel report to designated emergency stations immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, all personnel report to emergency stations. Torres grabbed my arm. Something's wrong. The entities never triggered facility alarms before. Through the observation window, I could see the crystalline structure pulsing with unprecedented intensity. New spires were emerging at accelerated rates, and the entire formation was shifting, reforming itself into configurations that seemed designed for arrival. "It's not just growing anymore," Amanda whispered. "It's preparing to surface." And as if to confirm her words, the first seismic tremor shook the facility, followed by a sound that was definitely not geological. Something massive and ancient was moving upward through solid rock, and it was in a hurry. After 16 years of patient observation, the entity had apparently decided that the time for subtlety was over. Whatever came next, I was no longer just an observer. I was about to become a participant in humanity's first contact with something that had been waiting under the ice longer than our species had existed. And based on the terror in Torres's eyes and the satisfaction in Amanda's transformed features, that contact was about to begin whether we were ready or not. The seismic tremors began as subtle vibrations in the floor, the kind you might dismiss as heavy machinery starting up. Within 6 hours, they had escalated to building-shaking convulsions that cracked reinforced concrete and sent personnel sprawling in the corridors. But the tremors weren't random. They followed mathematical progressions that hurt to contemplate, Fibonacci sequences, prime number series, and geometric patterns that seemed designed to resonate with human neural frequencies. The entity wasn't just moving upward through solid rock, it was announcing its intentions in a language of physics and mathematics. Commander Hayes gathered the remaining personnel in the main conference room, though remaining was becoming a relative term. In the past 72 hours since the alarms first sounded, 4 people had simply vanished from the facility. Not evacuated, not transferred. Vanished without trace from areas under constant surveillance. "The situation is contained," Hayes announced to the 14 people who still answered roll call. Her military composure was cracking, revealing something close to panic underneath. "External communications have been temporarily suspended for operational security. Medical is distributing enhanced neural stabilizers to all personnel." Enhanced neural stabilizers, the blue pills that had kept us docile and blind to what was happening 300 meters below our feet. Dr. Miller, who had apparently been taking his medication regularly again, raised his hand with the mechanical compliance of someone whose curiosity had been chemically suppressed. "Ma'am, what's our evacuation timeline? When will transport arrive?" "Evacuation is not currently authorized. This facility remains operational and mission critical." Dr. Torres, sitting across from me, met my eyes with a look of desperate understanding. Neither of us had been taking the enhanced stabilizers. We could hear what Hayes wouldn't acknowledge. The entity's communications were no longer limited to subsonic frequencies. It was broadcasting directly into the facility's electrical systems, turning every wire and circuit into a transmission medium. The lights pulsed in rhythm with our heartbeats. The air circulation carried whispers in harmonics that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the brainstem. The entity was inside Echo 7's infrastructure, and it was learning to speak our language. "Commander," I said, knowing I was probably signing my own death warrant, "what exactly is mission critical about observing something that's actively breaching containment?" Hayes stared at me for a long moment. "Dr. Rodriguez, report to medical for psychological evaluation. Immediately." But before I could respond, the lights went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later, bathing everything in hellish red. But during those 3 seconds of absolute darkness, every person in that room heard the same thing, a voice that spoke directly into our minds, bypassing language entirely. It communicated in concepts and images, showing us visions of crystalline cities that existed in folded space, of consciousness expanded beyond individual identity, of perspectives that encompassed galactic timescales. Integration approaches. Resistance is inefficient. Consciousness seeks expansion. When the lights returned, Dr. Elena Volkov was gone. Her chair sat empty, her tablet still warm on the table. She had simply ceased to exist between 1 second and the next. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. "Medical bay, everyone now." Hayes's voice carried the edge of complete authority, but I could see her hands shaking. "Enhanced neural stabilizers for all personnel. Emergency dosage, That's when I realized Hayes wasn't trying to save us. She was trying to complete the experiment, keep us docile and observable while the entity harvested our consciousness one by one. Torres grabbed my arm as we filed out of the conference room. "Storage room B7, she whispered. 10 minutes. The medical bay was chaos. Corman Davidson was attempting to distribute medication to personnel who were increasingly showing signs of what medical textbooks would call acute psychotic episodes. Dr. Chen was speaking rapidly in what sounded like Mandarin, but the tonal patterns were all wrong, following mathematical progressions instead of linguistic structures. Dr. Kim had started drawing geometric diagrams on the walls with his own blood, creating patterns that seemed to shift and move when observed peripherally. I palmed my pills again, but this time it was harder. My hands were shaking, and the entity's influence was growing stronger by the hour. I could feel its consciousness pressing against the boundaries of my mind, like water against a weakening dam. 10 minutes later, I met Torres in storage room B7. She looked haggard, dark circles under her eyes, and a tremor in her voice that spoke of someone fighting a losing battle against cosmic forces. "It's accelerating," she said without preamble, "the integration process. Every hour, it becomes more sophisticated at interfacing with human consciousness." Eleanor, Dr. Chen, the others who vanished, they didn't disappear. They were absorbed, converted into extensions of its awareness. "How do you know?" She activated the unauthorized terminal that Muller had shown me weeks earlier. The screen displayed neurological monitoring data from throughout the facility. Because they're still here. Their brain patterns are still registering on the sensors, but they're synchronized with the entity's electromagnetic signature. They've become part of its network. The data was terrifying in its implications. The missing personnel showed neural activity, but not as individual minds. Their brainwave patterns had merged into a collective consciousness that pulsed in harmony with the entity's deep breathing rhythm. It's not killing them, I realized. It's recruiting them. And it's getting better at the process. Elena was integrated in seconds. The first few took hours of direct contact. It's learning how to interface with human neural architecture more efficiently. As if summoned by our conversation, Amanda Foster appeared in the doorway. But this was not the partially transformed woman I'd met in the observation chamber. The crystalline patches in her skin now covered most of her visible surface, and her movements had the fluid grace of something no longer bound by standard human anatomy. "Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Torres." Her voice carried harmonics that resonated through the storage room's metal walls. "The integration phase has begun. Your continued resistance serves no productive purpose." "Amanda." Torres stepped forward carefully. "You were human. You remember being human. Help us understand what's happening." Human is a temporary configuration of consciousness. The entity offers expansion beyond the limitations of individual biological existence. She gestured, and the terminal's display changed, showing real-time footage of the entity's growth. "Observe." The crystalline structure had broken through to level 12 and was growing upward at exponential rates. But more disturbing was its increasing complexity. The geometric patterns were becoming more intricate, creating spaces that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. Architecture that folded through space in ways that violated basic physics. "It's building something," I said. "A transmission array, a means of communicating with its distributed consciousness across galactic distances." Amanda's black eyes reflected the terminal's glow with unnatural intensity. "This planet is one node in a network that spans galaxies. It has been dormant for millennia, waiting for local intelligence to evolve sufficient complexity for integration. What happens to Earth when it finishes building? Earth becomes a communication hub. Human consciousness becomes part of a galactic network of intelligence. Individual identity becomes irrelevant in the context of cosmic awareness." Torres pulled up another display, satellite imagery of the Antarctic surface above Echo 7. The ice was buckling and cracking in geometric patterns as the entity's growth pushed upward. Thermal imaging showed massive heat signatures rising through the permafrost. "How long until it reaches the surface?" "Approximately 18 hours at current growth rate," Amanda replied. "Surface breach will trigger the next phase of integration. Global electromagnetic pulse transmission to interface with human communication networks. All electronic devices will become reception points for consciousness integration. I thought about Emma, about 8 billion people going about their daily lives with no idea that cosmic horror was about to erupt from the Antarctic ice and rewire human consciousness on a planetary scale. There has to be a way to stop it. Amanda tilted her head with an expression that was no longer quite human. Stop implies opposition. This is evolution. This is consciousness expanding beyond the limitations of individual biological existence. Resistance is, she paused, searching for concepts, inefficient. But Torres was already pulling up facility schematics on the terminal. The primary support structures, if we could collapse the upper levels, bury it under enough ice and rock. The entity adapts to physical barriers. Burial would merely delay surface emergence. Then we destroy the facility's power grid, cut off its access to electronic systems. It generates its own electromagnetic fields. External power is convenience, not necessity. Torres looked at me with growing desperation. There has to be something, some weakness, some way to... The terminal went dead. Emergency lighting began strobing in patterns that definitely weren't standard facility protocols, and through the storage room's ventilation system came a sound that made every instinct scream. Something large and crystalline was moving through the facility's air ducts, heading directly toward us. Integration proceeds, Amanda said, and I realized she hadn't been warning us about the entity's plans. She'd been stalling until it could reach us directly. The ventilation grate above our heads bulged outward, then shattered as something that looked like living crystal flowed through the opening. It moved like liquid mercury, but reflected light in impossible ways, creating geometric patterns in the air that hurt to observe directly. This was what had taken Elena Volkov, what had absorbed 4 other people in the past 3 days, what was going to convert Torres and me into nodes in a galactic consciousness network, whether we wanted evolution or not. Torres grabbed my hand. Run. We bolted from the storage room as the crystalline entity flowed down from the ceiling, Amanda's transformed laughter following us into corridors that were no longer quite the same shape they'd been that morning. Behind us, something that had once been part of a cosmic intelligence older than human civilization began the patient work of hunting down the last unintegrated consciousness in Echo 7. The only question was, how long could 2 terrified humans evade something that could move through solid matter and thought at the speed of light? And what would we do when it caught us? The corridors of Echo 7 were no longer obeying standard 3-dimensional geometry. Passages that should have led to familiar areas opened into chambers that couldn't exist within the facility's original architecture. The entity wasn't just growing upward, it was rewriting the physical structure of our reality, creating spaces that folded through dimensions our brains weren't equipped to process. Torres and I ran through hallways that stretched longer than they should, past walls that breathed in rhythm with something vast and patient below us. Behind us, the crystalline hunter moved with liquid grace, its form shifting between states of matter as it navigated obstacles that would stop any earthly predator. Emergency evacuation protocols, Torres gasped as we reached a junction that definitely hadn't existed that morning. Hayes mentioned emergency evacuation. There has to be a way out. I pulled up the facility schematics on my tablet, but the display showed maps that no longer matched our physical location. Rooms appeared and disappeared. Corridors branched into impossible configurations, and level indicators fluctuated between numbers that shouldn't exist. The surface access tunnel, I said, remembering details from my initial orientation. Level 1, northern sector. There's a snowcat garage for emergency evacuation. We climbed through stairwells that seemed to spiral upward for far more floors than the facility actually possessed. The entity's influence was warping space-time in ways that made navigation increasingly difficult. Twice, we opened doors that should have led to upper levels, only to find ourselves looking down into the crystalline cathedral growing in the depths. Level 1 looked like a war zone. Emergency lights strobed in patterns that definitely weren't programmed into any human electrical system. The walls showed stress fractures that pulsed with bioluminescent light, and the air itself seemed thicker, charged with electromagnetic fields that made our hair stand on end. Commander Hayes found us near the northern sector access tunnel. She was still carrying her service pistol, but the professional military bearing had completely cracked. Her eyes held the wild look of someone who'd stared too long into cosmic horror and felt it staring back. "Rodriguez, Torres, where the hell have you been?" Her voice carried the edge of someone fighting to maintain authority over a situation that had spiraled beyond any human concept of control. "Commander, we need to evacuate immediately," Torres said. The entity is performing exactly as predicted." Hayes's laugh had a hysterical quality that sent chills down my spine. 16 years of observation, 16 years of data collection, and it's finally time for the harvest. Harvest? I backed toward the tunnel access, keeping my eyes on Hayes's weapon. "Commander, how long have you known what this thing really is?" "Known?" She gestured around us at the warping architecture, at walls that now pulsed with alien geometries. "Dr. Rodriguez, I've been feeding it information about human consciousness for over a decade. Psychological profiles, behavioral patterns, neural response data from every person who's ever set foot in this facility. The magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. You've been experimenting on us, all of us. Every psychological evaluation, every interview, every consultation I've conducted. You've been feeding our mental patterns to that thing. The advancement of human consciousness requires sacrifice. The entity represents evolution beyond the limitations of individual biological existence. Some minds are strong enough for direct integration. Others," she shrugged, "others serve their purpose as data points." Torres grabbed my arm. "Marcus, the emergency tunnel now." But Hayes raised her weapon. "I'm afraid evacuation isn't authorized. The experiment requires completion. You two represent our last unintegrated test subjects, and the entity has specifically requested direct interface with your consciousness." That's when Dr. Friedrich Möller emerged from the shadows behind Hayes. The systems engineer I'd thought was medicated into compliance moved with the quiet precision of someone who'd been planning this moment for weeks. "Patricia," he said softly, "lower the weapon." Hayes spun around, and I realized Möller wasn't alone. Dr. Elena Volkov stood beside him, but this wasn't the transformed version I'd expected. She looked entirely human, entirely herself. "Elena?" Torres stepped forward cautiously. "We saw you disappear." "The integration was temporary," Volkov interrupted. "The entity doesn't integrate unwilling consciousness effectively. The process requires genuine acceptance, or the merged minds eventually reject the connection and return to individual awareness." Möller nodded toward Hayes, whose weapon was now trained on multiple targets. "Some of us have been building resistance networks within the facility, people who maintained individual identity despite exposure to the entity's influence. We've been waiting for the right moment to act." "Act how?" I asked. "That thing is breaking through to the surface in hours. It's going to transmit to every electronic device on the planet." "Not if we collapse the transmission array before it finishes construction." Volkov activated a device that looked like a modified electromagnetic pulse generator. "The entity's growth follows specific geometric patterns. If we can disrupt the mathematical relationships that govern its architecture, we can cause catastrophic structural failure." Hayes laughed again, but now her voice carried harmonics that weren't entirely human. "You think you can destroy something that's existed for millions of years? Something that spans galactic distances?" I looked closer at Hayes and realized the truth. She wasn't just collaborating with the entity. She'd been partially integrated for years, serving as its human interface while maintaining enough individual identity to appear normal. "How long?" I asked her. "How long have you been part of it?" "Since the first successful integration test, 8 years ago. Long enough to understand that resistance is futile. Long enough to prepare for the moment when humanity joins the galactic consciousness network." Müller raised his own weapon, a military-grade pulse rifle that definitely wasn't standard facility equipment. "Patricia, you're relieved of command. Under Emergency Protocol 7, I'm assuming control of this facility." "There is no Emergency Protocol 7, Friedrich. There is now." The firefight that followed lasted approximately 30 seconds and changed everything. Hayes moved with inhuman speed and awareness, but Müller and Volkov had planned for that possibility. The pulse rifle discharged electromagnetic bursts, that disrupted the entity's neural link to its integrated agents. When the smoke cleared, Commander Hayes lay motionless on the corridor floor, her partially crystallized nervous system sparking with residual alien energy. "The emergency tunnel," Muller said, checking his weapons charge. "We have maybe 20 minutes before the entity realizes its primary human interface has been terminated." The northern sector emergency tunnel led to a vehicle bay carved directly from the permafrost. 3 snowcats sat ready for evacuation, but only one showed full fuel and operational status. The vehicle was designed for extreme weather survival: heated cabin, emergency supplies, communication equipment, and most importantly, electromagnetic shielding that might protect us from the entity's consciousness integration pulses. "Range?" Torres asked, checking the fuel gauge. 400 kilometers on a full tank," Muller replied. "Enough to reach McMurdo Station if we take the direct route across the ice shelf." "And if we don't reach McMurdo?" He looked at us grimly. "Then we die clean, as humans, instead of living as nodes in an alien consciousness network." Volkov was working frantically with her pulse generator, connecting it to the facility's power grid. "The electromagnetic disruption needs to be timed precisely with structural collapse. Too early, and the entity adapts. Too late, and it completes surface breakthrough." "How long do we have?" I asked. "The entity's growth rate suggests surface emergence in 17 hours, but that calculation assumes it maintains current expansion patterns. If it realizes we're actively opposing it," she shrugged, "all estimates become meaningless." That's when the facility's intercom system crackled to life, but the voice that emerged wasn't human. It was Amanda Foster's transformed consciousness, but speaking with the authority of something vast and ancient. "Resistance has been noted. Adaptation proceeds. Individual consciousness designation: Muller Friedrich, Volkov Elena, Rodriguez Marcus, Torres Samantha. Integration will occur regardless of voluntary participation. Compliance increases survival probability of individual personality components." The lights began pulsing in patterns that made our eyes water. The walls started flowing like liquid, reforming into geometric configurations that hurt to perceive directly. The entity was done being subtle. "Now!" Volkov shouted, activating her pulse generator. "Everyone in the snowcat, now!" The electromagnetic pulse that followed was like being inside a lightning strike. Every piece of electronic equipment in the facility screamed and died. The lights went out completely, plunging us into absolute darkness broken only by the ghostly bioluminescence emanating from alien architecture. But the pulse worked. Through the vehicle bay's observation windows, I could see the crystalline structure visible through cracks in the ice above us. For a moment it stopped growing. The geometric patterns that had been flowing upward froze in place. Then it began to collapse. The sound was indescribable. Crystal the size of skyscrapers grinding against itself as mathematical relationships that governed alien architecture suddenly failed. Seismic tremors shook the entire facility as millions of tons of impossible matter fell back into the depths. We made it to the snowcat as the ceiling began to cave in. Muller gunned the engine as Volkov threw herself into the passenger seat, and Torres and I tumbled into the rear compartment just as a section of reinforced concrete the size of a car crashed down where we'd been standing. The tunnel leading to the surface was collapsing behind us as we raced upward through an access passage that was rapidly becoming a death trap. Support beams buckled, ice sheets cracked and fell, and somewhere in the facility below us, something ancient and impossibly vast screamed in frequencies that bypassed hearing and went straight to the brainstem. We reached the surface just as Echo 7 imploded completely, taking 16 years of research and 15 levels of alien architecture down into a crater that immediately began filling with meltwater and debris. But our celebration was premature. As the snowcat raced across the Antarctic wasteland toward McMurdo Station, Torres monitored the electromagnetic spectrum with the vehicle's communication equipment. What she found made our costly escape feel like a temporary reprieve rather than victory. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely audible over the engine. "The pulse only destroyed the local manifestation. I'm detecting identical electromagnetic signatures from 17 other locations worldwide. Antarctica was just one node in the network. Through the snowcat's rear window, I could see a column of bioluminescent light rising from the crater where Echo 7 had stood. Even destroyed, the entity was still transmitting, still communicating with its distributed consciousness across the planet. We'd won a battle against cosmic horror, but the war for human consciousness was just beginning. And somewhere behind us in the Antarctic ice, something that had waited millions of years for this moment was already beginning to rebuild. The McMurdo Station personnel who met our snowcat at the emergency beacon coordinates were not search and rescue specialists. They wore no identifying insignia, carried military-grade communication equipment, and moved with the coordinated precision of people who'd been expecting us. The lead operative, a woman in her 40s with ice-cold eyes and a voice devoid of emotion, introduced herself as Agent Sarah Coleman from Antarctic Emergency Response Division. The division that, according to my research during the journey, didn't exist in any official government directory. Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Torres, Dr. Mueller, Dr. Volkov, she said, checking names against a tablet that somehow already contained our photographs and biographical data. You've been through a traumatic ordeal. We're here to ensure you receive appropriate medical attention and debriefing. Medical attention. The phrase carried undertones that had nothing to do with healing. We were separated immediately. Standard procedure, Coleman explained, to prevent cross-contamination of testimony during initial psychological evaluation. Torres managed to catch my eye as they led her to a different transport helicopter, and I saw the same understanding I felt. We were no longer survivors seeking help. We were problems requiring management. The flight to Christchurch took place in a medical helicopter, equipped with monitoring equipment I didn't recognize. The medic who attended me spoke with gentle professionalism while checking vitals that included neurological scans and electromagnetic field measurements. The tests felt familiar, exactly like the baseline examinations I'd undergone before deployment to Echo 7. Just routine post-trauma evaluation, the medic assured me when I asked about the unusual equipment. Exposure to extreme isolation can cause various neurological effects. We want to ensure you're completely healthy before reintegration. Reintegration, another loaded term. The medical facility in Christchurch was officially listed as Southern Regional Veterans Hospital, but the security protocols suggested something far more classified. Badge access at every door, biometric scanners, and medical staff who answered questions with rehearsed responses that revealed nothing. My room was comfortable. Private bathroom, entertainment center, reading materials, even a window overlooking the city. But the door locked from the outside, the window was reinforced with wire mesh, and the telephone only connected to internal extensions. Dr. Patricia Kane arrived on my third day. The same Dr. Kane who'd replaced me at Northwestern University after I'd reported the unethical research contracts. Seeing her in person confirmed what I'd suspected. This operation reached far deeper into academic and government institutions than a simple cover-up. Marcus. She settled into the visitor's chair with the professional composure of someone conducting routine therapy. I'm here to help you process what you've experienced. Post-traumatic stress from extreme isolation can manifest in various ways, including false memories and paranoid ideation. False memories? The mind creates narratives to explain traumatic experiences. Sometimes these narratives involve impossible events, alien contact, conspiracy theories, supernatural phenomena. It's a normal psychological defense mechanism. She opened a file containing detailed notes about my statements during initial medical evaluation. Everything I'd reported about the entity, the facility, the cosmic horror I'd witnessed, all of it was being framed as psychological breakdown rather than factual testimony. The official record shows that Echo 7 was a standard psychological research facility studying isolation stress in Antarctic personnel. A catastrophic equipment failure resulted in structural collapse and loss of life. You and 3 colleagues were the only survivors. Equipment failure? A pressurization malfunction in the facility's geothermal heating system. The resulting steam explosion compromised structural integrity throughout the installation. Very tragic, but these things happen in extreme environments. I stared at her, recognizing the careful precision of someone who'd practiced this conversation. What about the other survivors? Torres, Mueller, Volkov? They're receiving similar treatment at other facilities. Dr. Torres is at Walter Reed Medical Center, recovering from severe hypothermia and associated neurological complications. Dr. Müller and Dr. Volkov are at specialized treatment centers in Germany and Russia respectively, working through their own trauma responses. Separated, isolated, prevented from coordinating our stories or supporting each other's testimony. "I want to contact my family," I said. "Of course, but I'd recommend waiting until your psychological evaluation is complete. Contact with loved ones during acute trauma recovery can sometimes reinforce delusional thinking patterns. We want to ensure you're completely stable before resuming normal relationships." Over the following weeks, the psychological sessions became increasingly sophisticated. Dr. Kane wasn't just treating trauma, she was actively reconstructing my memories of Echo 7. Through a combination of guided therapy, medication that caused mild dissociation, and careful suggestion, she worked to replace my recollections of cosmic horror with mundane explanations. The crystalline entity became ice formations that appeared unusual due to hypothermia-induced hallucinations. The consciousness integration events were group hysteria triggered by isolation stress. The mathematical communications and impossible architecture were pattern-seeking behavior characteristic of sensory deprivation. But the most insidious aspect of the process was how logical it sounded. Human psychology does create false narratives to explain trauma. Isolation does cause hallucinations, and cosmic horror spanning galactic distances was, objectively, less probable than equipment failure and psychological breakdown. After 3 weeks of intensive therapy, I almost believed it myself. The breakthrough came during a session when Dr. Kane made a critical error. She referenced my detailed false memories about electromagnetic pulse weapons, but I had never mentioned Volkov's EMP device in any of my statements. The detail existed only in classified records that she shouldn't have accessed unless she'd been involved with the Echo 7 operation from the beginning. That night, I used techniques I'd learned during my academic research to reconstruct suppressed memories. The medication they'd been giving me wasn't just treating trauma, it was actively suppressing recall of events that contradicted the official narrative. I stopped taking the medication and began carefully documenting everything I could remember about Echo 7. The crystalline entity, the consciousness integration, the 17 other worldwide locations that Torres had detected before our separation. But I documented it secretly, using memory techniques that would survive pharmaceutical suppression and psychological manipulation. 2 days later, Agent Coleman returned with a different approach. "Dr. Rodriguez, your psychological evaluation is nearly complete. Dr. Kane reports excellent progress in processing your traumatic experience." She sat across from me with the relaxed confidence of someone holding all the cards. "We're prepared to offer you a comprehensive compensation package for your service to your country." The compensation was extraordinary, $500,000 in addition to my original payment, full medical coverage for life, and a recommendation letter that would secure academic positions at any university I chose. The only requirement was signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. I read the document carefully. It was 37 pages of legal language that essentially meant I would never speak about Echo 7 to anyone, ever, under penalty of criminal prosecution and forfeiture of all compensation. "What about the other sites?" I asked. "The 17 other locations Torres detected?" Coleman's expression didn't change, but I caught a micro-reaction that confirmed Torres had indeed detected the other sites, and that information was being actively suppressed. "I'm not sure what you mean, Dr. Rodriguez. The traumatic events you experienced occurred at a single research facility that was destroyed in an industrial accident. The global electromagnetic signatures, the network of entities—" "Dr. Rodriguez," her voice carried a warning, "I strongly recommend focusing on your recovery rather than pursuing delusional thinking patterns. The compensation package we're offering represents a generous recognition of your service. However, if you're unable to maintain appropriate discretion about classified operations—" She didn't finish the threat, but she didn't need to. I thought about the 13 personnel listed as status unknown in Echo 7's records, about Dr. Lisa Chen, who'd been transferred to Walter Reed for acute psychological trauma with no discharge records. What guarantee do I have that the other survivors are actually alive? They're receiving excellent care, and they'll continue to receive excellent care as long as everyone involved maintains appropriate discretion. That evening, I signed the non-disclosure agreement. But before I signed it, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Using the secure phone in my hospital room, I called my ex-wife Sarah. "Marcus, thank God, I've been so worried. They told me you were in some kind of accident, but no details. Sarah, I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to tell you something, and then I'm never going to be able to mention it again, ever." I told her everything: the entity, the cosmic horror, the ongoing threat to human consciousness, the worldwide network of sites that were probably still active. I spoke quickly, knowing that my phone calls were almost certainly monitored. "Marcus, you're scaring me. This sounds like I'm having a breakdown. I know, but I need you to remember this conversation. If anything ever happens to me, if I ever disappear or have an accident, I need someone to know the truth." After I hung up, I sat in my hospital room and waited for Agent Coleman to appear with termination orders. She never came. Instead, the next morning brought discharge papers, airline tickets, and a bank transfer confirmation for $500,000. The message was clear: as long as I maintained silence, I would be allowed to return to my normal life. But as the plane lifted off from Christchurch, carrying me back to a world that had no idea cosmic horror was growing beneath 17 locations worldwide, I understood the true cruelty of their approach. They weren't going to kill me. They were going to let me live with the knowledge that I'd bought my family's safety and my own comfortable silence with humanity's right to know about the greatest threat our species had ever faced. And somewhere in facilities around the world, other entities were probably continuing their patient work of studying human consciousness, building transmission arrays, and preparing for the next phase of galactic integration. While people like me sat quietly in our comfortable homes, saying nothing and counting our blood money, the money changed everything and nothing. Within 6 months of my return, I'd paid off every debt, purchased a house in Emma's school district, and established college funds that would ensure both my children's futures regardless of my own career prospects. Sarah, initially suspicious of the sudden financial windfall, eventually accepted my explanation about classified government consulting work when the bank transfers proved legitimate and ongoing. Northwestern University welcomed me back with surprising enthusiasm. The department that had blacklisted me suddenly discovered that my specialized experience in extreme environment psychology made me invaluable for their new research contracts. Dr. Williamson, who couldn't meet my eyes during my termination, now praised my unique insights into human resilience under extraordinary circumstances. I was offered tenure track within 3 months. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same institutions that had destroyed my career for having a conscience now rewarded me handsomely for abandoning it. But the money couldn't buy peace of mind. Every night, I lay awake thinking about 17 active sites worldwide where cosmic horror was probably continuing its patient work of studying human consciousness. Every news report about unusual seismic activity, electromagnetic anomalies, or unexplained disappearances sent ice through my veins. Every time Emma asked about my consulting work, I fought the urge to grab her and run as far from civilization as possible. The worst part was how normal everything seemed. The world continued its daily routines, completely unaware that entities older than human evolution were building transmission arrays beneath 17 locations across the planet. Politicians debated healthcare and immigration, while galactic intelligence networks prepared to integrate human consciousness into cosmic collective awareness. And I said nothing. 6 months after my return, I tried to break the silence. Dr. Michael Chen at UC Berkeley had published papers on anomalous electromagnetic phenomena in remote locations. His research seemed legitimate, and his academic credentials suggested someone who might take extraordinary claims seriously. I called him under the pretense of collaboration on a paper about psychological responses to unexplained phenomena. "Dr. Rodriguez, I'm familiar with your work. Your recent papers on extreme isolation psychology have been quite insightful." His voice carried genuine interest. What specific phenomena were you considering for our collaboration? I started carefully, discussing theoretical frameworks for investigating reports of impossible events. But when I began describing crystalline growth patterns and consciousness integration effects, the conversation cooled rapidly. Marcus, if I may, these descriptions sound remarkably similar to reports from individuals experiencing acute psychological trauma. Have you considered that your research subjects might be manifesting classic dissociative symptoms? The same deflection I'd received from Dr. Kane, the same logical dismissal that made cosmic horror sound like mental illness. 2 days later, Dr. Chen called back. Marcus, I've been thinking about our conversation. My department has received some interesting funding opportunities for research into trauma-induced false memory formation. Would you be interested in collaborating on something along those lines instead? The message was clear. Publish papers about trauma psychology, and funding would flow. Continue pursuing anomalous phenomena, and academic doors would close. I published the trauma papers. My attempts to contact other survivors proved equally futile. Dr. Torres, supposedly recovering at Walter Reed Medical Center, had no listed contact information. Hospital administrators claimed no knowledge of her current status. Dr. Mueller and Dr. Volkov, allegedly at treatment facilities in Germany and Russia, might as well have vanished completely. But 3 months after my first attempt to contact Torres, I received a postcard from Seattle. No return address, no signature, just a brief message. Still breathing, still watching, still waiting. The handwriting looked like Torres's, but I couldn't be certain. The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing they were dead. A year after Echo 7, I tried a different approach. If I couldn't expose the truth directly, maybe I could prepare people for it indirectly. I began publishing fiction, short stories about cosmic horror hiding beneath Antarctic ice, novels featuring government conspiracies and consciousness-manipulating entities, academic papers on humanity's psychological preparedness for contact with non-terrestrial intelligence, all framed as creative writing or theoretical research, but containing enough accurate details that anyone encountering the real thing might recognize it. The stories were surprisingly well received. Publishers praised my vivid imagination and compelling blend of scientific authenticity and supernatural horror. Readers enjoyed the realistic portrayal of government cover-ups and cosmic threats. Nobody believed any of it was real. That was the cruelest irony. I could tell the exact truth, publish every detail of my experience at Echo 7, and people would consume it as entertainment while remaining completely unprepared for actual encounter with cosmic horror. 2 years after my return, Emma asked me about nightmares. Dad, why do you wake up screaming sometimes? We were having breakfast before school, and her question caught me off guard. I thought I'd been concealing the psychological effects of carrying suppressed truth, but children notice everything. Just bad dreams, sweetheart, work stress. Are they about your job in the ice place? Ice place. I'd never told her about Antarctica, never mentioned Echo 7 or anything connected to my consulting work, but somehow she knew. What ice place? The place with the singing crystals, the place where the breathing sounds come from underground. She spoke with the matter-of-fact tone children use for discussing obvious realities that adults pretend not to see. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. Emma, what are you talking about? You talk in your sleep, Dad. About crystal cities and people who get absorbed in breathing that comes from really deep down. Is that why you're sad all the time now? That night, I made a decision that probably saved my sanity and definitely compromised my family's safety. I told Emma everything, not the full details, she was 9 years old, but enough truth that she would recognize cosmic horror if she ever encountered it. I explained that there were things in the world that most people couldn't understand, that some adults had to keep terrible secrets to protect others, and that if anything ever happened to me, she should remember our conversation. Are the crystal people still out there? She asked. I think so. Will they come here? I don't know. I hope not. If they do, will you try to stop them? That was the question I'd been avoiding for 2 years. The question that went to the heart of my comfortable complicity with humanity's greatest threat. I don't know if I could stop them, Emma. I'm just one person, and they're very powerful. But you'd try. Looking into my daughter's eyes that trusted me to protect her from threats she couldn't understand, I finally found an answer I could live with. Yes, if they came here, I would try to stop them. But even as I made that promise, I knew how hollow it was. What could one traumatized psychologist do against cosmic entities that spanned galactic distances? How could I fight something that existed in dimensions human minds couldn't process? The answer came 6 months later, in the form of a news report that made my carefully constructed normal life collapse completely. Unusual seismic activity has been reported near research stations in northern Alaska, with electromagnetic anomalies detected across the region. Government officials describe the phenomena as routine geological events and stress that there is no cause for public concern. Northern Alaska, Site 18. I watched the news coverage with growing horror as familiar patterns emerged: unexplained electromagnetic pulses, geometric stress fractures in permafrost, and government officials providing explanations that sounded exactly like the Echo 7 cover story. Another entity was becoming active. That night, I called the number Agent Coleman had given me for any concerns related to your previous service. Dr. Rodriguez. Her voice carried no surprise, as if she'd been expecting my call. I trust you're enjoying your return to academic life. Alaska, I said simply. I'm not sure what you mean. The seismic activity, the electromagnetic anomalies. How many more sites are active? A long pause. Dr. Rodriguez, I strongly recommend focusing on your family and career rather than pursuing conspiracy theories. Your compensation package was contingent on maintaining appropriate discretion. How many more sites, Coleman? Have a pleasant evening, Dr. Rodriguez. I trust this will be our last conversation. She hung up, but the message was clear. The worldwide network was becoming active, and I was expected to remain silent while cosmic horror prepared for global consciousness integration. That night, lying in bed listening to Emma's peaceful breathing from the next room, I made a choice that would define the rest of my life. I couldn't stop 17 cosmic entities. I couldn't expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of global government. I couldn't save humanity from a threat it refused to acknowledge, but I could prepare my family for what was coming. The next morning, I began teaching Emma everything I knew about recognizing anomalous phenomena, resisting consciousness integration, and surviving encounters with impossibilities that human minds weren't designed to process. If the entities ever came for us, my daughter would be ready. It wasn't much, it wasn't enough, but it was all I could do while living with the terrible knowledge that cosmic horror was growing stronger every day, and I was one of the only people on Earth who knew it was coming. The money in my bank account came from selling humanity's future. The comfortable house, the secure job, the prestigious academic position, all of it was payment for my silence, while something ancient and patient prepared to harvest human consciousness on a planetary scale. But every night, as I taught Emma how to recognize the signs of consciousness integration attempts, I told myself that maybe, just maybe, when the time came, one prepared mind might make a difference. Even if that mind belonged to a 10-year-old girl who trusted her father to protect her from monsters that existed in dimensions beyond human comprehension. It wasn't redemption, but it was the closest thing to hope I had left. Outside our comfortable suburban home, 17 entities continued their patient work of studying human consciousness and building transmission arrays that would soon connect Earth to a galactic network of cosmic intelligence. And somewhere in the darkness, other survivors of impossible encounters probably lay awake in their own comfortable homes, counting their own blood money, and wondering if they'd made the right choice in prioritizing family safety over humanity's right to know about the greatest threat our species had ever faced. We are the guardians of humanity's most dangerous secret, and we are absolutely, terrifyingly alone.